Welcome everybody today to the True Blood Performing Arts Center YouTube channel. Our guest today, who's our first guest, needs very little introduction. Dick Purinton, an artist, a writer, a poet, and previous president of the Ferry Line. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's now passed down to your son, Hoyt.
Correct.
Welcome. We're so glad you're here today. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Great to do an interview for the TPAC, but also be, I guess, your first interview. So.
Yes. Yeah, we can trip through this together. That's, yeah, good. Thank you for being here. Well, I want to start by saying, in preparing for today, one of the things I was aware of but really struck home was the reliance that we all have on the ferry line for bringing services, goods, all of these things, how dependent we are all on it. And thank you. Thank you for providing consistent service through all of these years, which, and if we can just briefly review kind of the history, it started in 1940. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of a timeline and where you came into the picture?
The present company, Washington Island Ferry Line Incorporated, began in 1940, picking up from efforts made by several operators, but primarily William Jepson, who began operating wooden ferries. But then in 1940, Carl and Arnie Richter. Carl had been a commercial fisherman. Arnie had done a number of things, but was a wholesaler of fish, whitefish primarily.
So he had to go, he went back and forth between the mainland?
No, well, to some degree. They hauled fish back and forth in a small fish boat, actually.
Yeah.
When they were asked one winter by the fishermen themselves if they would be interested in transporting fish to the mainland.
And they put sleds, right, on these wooden boats.
They did whatever they had to do. Cross the ice with a sleigh, sometimes drawn by hand.
Any documented disasters? Sounds like that has potential to be very risky.
They had their difficulties, and Arnie recounts one time at least where they were going across with an automobile, and they always took planks with them because if the ice happened to open up a bit, but they could still get across the crack, and, you know, they would try to jump the crack, so to speak.
Yeah.
And cars were a bit lighter, I think, back then. That was helpful.
Oh.
I don't know if the clearance was any better. You know, over the ice is not glass smooth as a skating rink might be.
Right.
Oftentimes it's rough, jumbled ice or windrows of ice, snowdrifts, etc., that have to be encountered too. But they did a combination of both over the ice and using their small fishing boat, actually operating out of the East Channel near the shipyard marina. That usually waves and current kind of opens that area up, and they were able to keep a boat in there, not easily.
Longer than other parts.
Yes, and then they'd go around the far end, south end of Detroit Island, and to the peninsula mainland, wherever they could get in. Oftentimes it was toward Europe Bay, which is a bit south of Northport.
Okay. So that happened between 1940 and 1950, right? That was that time frame?
Yes, really up through 1946.
Okay.
Things changed a bit. They had wooden vessels that they purchased from William Jepson, susceptible to ice and damage in ice, especially heavy shoving ice.
Yeah.
It was really too dangerous with a wooden hull. But in 1946, after the war, they had then materials that they could purchase for shipbuilding to build a new ferry. Financing was the key problem there because they hadn't been able to amass enough revenues, and times were a bit tough. It was really a period not of booming tourism, not at all. It was really farming, fishing, and some basic industries with an island population that was beginning to lessen because of the war, people moving away, taking jobs elsewhere.
Yeah,
so
that the population here was going down at that time.
And the island population as a whole wasn't as great, and the economy was real challenging at the time. But they were able to get financing and built the Griffin, steel hull ferry. So with that, they at least felt they had a better...
So the first steel hull ferry, the Griffin, was what year?
In 1946, that was put into service.
Okay.
And it didn't have, well, it was a 9-car capacity, but a very tight 9 cars.
Right.
And it didn't have the horsepower that you would really like to have for a vessel working in ice.
In particular, I would imagine, yeah.
But it provided safety. In other words, the hull itself was going to be safe
sound.
And sound, and that was important. And people were traveling rather than going over the ice themselves. They would be able to go on the ferry. I think it was 1 scheduled round trip per day, but nothing on Sunday. They didn't run on Sunday for a number of years. And then finally they added Sunday. I suppose the demand was there, what have you. But that took a while for all of that to develop.
And that makes me think the Griffin is no longer in service, right? Where do boats go when they are retired? What happens to boats?
It depends on the quality of the vessel, but almost always they are recycled. They go to someone else who has a use for it. And in this case,
recycled intact, not torn apart and used for parts, but
generally speaking, that's true. Now, in the case of the Griffin, Arnie had a new ferry in mind, something with a flat, open deck that could carry small trucks. At that time, semis were much shorter, but small trucks as well as cars. And that was the Voyager in 1960. So with that vessel coming online, and then another to follow in 1970, the Arabaki, similar to the Voyager but larger, and also having a stern ramp so cars could exit through the stern. They sold the Griffin to the Anderson Transportation Company, and Cecil, Jackie Anderson, Jim Anderson's father and uncle, they were transporting goods from the island to Sturgeon Bay and Green Bay and then bringing oil and other products back to the island. Very labor-intensive type of business, but they did that 1 or 2 trips per week throughout the sailing season, basically April through November. And so they had the Griffin, but they converted it to an oiler, from a ferry to an oiler. So they had tanks in which they could put petroleum products, gasoline and fuel oil, heating oil, and so forth. Prior to that, the product came in by barrels, which was a really intensive, and they also, barrels, and then eventually, right after the war, they built a barge called the Oil Queen. But anyway, the Griffin then kind of superseded the barge. And they began to, nationally, there were oil spills and problems and environmental cleanups, and people were becoming conscious of the damage that could be done to the environment and the danger of single tank barges. And so the Oil Queen was phased out. And the Griffin then was run as an oiler for a number of years until Cecil and Jackie Anderson decided to get out of the business. They then sold that vessel to a fellow from Chicago who converted it back into a passenger vessel.
It seems like I read that boat is currently on the Chicago River or something, isn't it? Like
it was in Chicago, and I don't think was particularly successful the way it had been converted and the idea that the owner had for it. It was sort of an excursion, dinner cruise type of thing, but it wasn't a very fancy product. And it just didn't make it economically. It was sold to somebody in Florida, and I think they enhanced the vessel once again for dining underway and that sort of thing. And the last that I've heard, it was in Jacksonville, Florida. I don't know if it's still there.
Okay, so that's where it retired, in Jacksonville, Florida, like so many other people.
Yeah, that happens. Yeah.
That happens.
There's almost always someone looking for a boat. You know, maybe their budget isn't quite as good, so they're looking for a used product that they can fix up. And
so I want to bring it to the icebreaker boats. There's been 3, right, total?
4 now, yeah.
4, so the Madonna is the 4th total.
Yes.
And can you just run through their names again for me? So we've got the Griffin,
C.G. Richter, which was named for Arnie's father, Carl Godfrey Richter.
Yes.
And then the Arnie J. Richter, and then, that came online in 2003.
Yeah.
And the Madonna.
Yeah.
And in building this newest ferry, which, you know, face it, if we didn't have traffic in volume in summer, we would never even think about building another winter ferry, and maybe couldn't even afford to operate a winter ferry. But that makes it possible, the summer volume, the summer revenues.
Right. And you thought, we're going to build a new boat, let's make it usable year-round. What was the thought process behind adding another icebreaker to the fleet?
Well, it was somewhat by committee. You know, it wasn't my idea, certainly, not my idea alone. I have to really say that it generated primarily from our crew and from Rich Ellison and Hoyt, my son Hoyt.
Yeah.
You know, their thought process was, if we had a problem with the Arnie J. Richter being our only winter ferry, and
what are we going to do?
What do you do? So we had a few mechanical issues, and I think there was one hull issue, and you have to work to make sure that the vessel will get through that winter ice season, and then you take care of whatever that problem is, or you work hard to bring in Caterpillar or the maintenance and service people, so that you take the boat out of service for maybe 6, 12, 18 hours, do the fix, and then put it back in service, and hope that no emergencies pop up in the meantime.
Right, so you're rushing a fix on the only boat that can get through ice in the winter.
Right. So this, having a second vessel with ice capabilities gives that option of having a backup. And we also look at engine hours. The vessel itself is still extremely serviceable. It was very well built, but the engines begin to get up on hours, and you need a major overhaul. So that's something that we try to avoid having happen during the middle of winter, and so this vessel gives that breathing space.
That's wonderful. I'm grateful for it. It's good for all of us here.
And it also happens to have greater capacity, which is also another really thing that's useful in the summer, but it's also proving useful this time of year.
Absolutely.